10 år har tyske Jürgen Bühler ledet internasjonale kristne ambassadeJerusalem. Perioden under ham har vært preget av vekst og nye nedslagsfelt i den globale kristenheten. På grunn av koronarestriksjoner kunne han dessverre ikke delta her med oss i dag. Derimot har han sendt oss sin hilsen til Oslo Symposium, som du nå skal få se.
Greetings from Jerusalem to the Oslo Symposium, and in particular very special greetings to my dear friend Dag Juliussen and the entire organizing committee of the Oslo Symposium. It's a great joy and privilege to talk to you today. Unfortunately, because of the COVID restrictions, I'm not able to join you in person, but I hope that this video message and greeting does reach you well. I would like to talk to you today in this very historic season in which we are finding ourselves in the Middle East about the role of Europe in regard to Israel, the European challenge with Israel, you could say. And I want to address, first of all, our history a little bit and look back over the past 10-20 years, where we have to say that in the past decades, Europe always was known as a strong supporter, in particular for the existence of the State of Israel. This was in particular important as many nations around Israel were threatening the very existence of the State of Israel. And Europe was always therefore a continent, a group of nations that Israel could rely on, that they would defend the existence of Israel. Even in the midst of many criticism that came out of Europe, they still were a reliable partner. But the situation today is changing in a very significant way, that today Europe sometimes has been perceived in regard to the wider neighborhood of Israel as even more critical than some of the Arab neighbors Israel has today. Therefore, I would like to bring a challenge to Europe to change its policy and its attitude towards Israel, highlight some of the challenges that I feel we are facing, and also I want to bring an appeal to Christians, in particular Christians in Europe, to pray for our continent, to pray for the countries where we are coming from, and of course for you in the Oslo Symposium to pray for the relationship of your very own country in regard to its relationship to Israel. Now, the first thing that really changed and that brought forth a paradigm shift in the wider Middle East is the very role that Israel is playing here in the Middle East. As I said before, the existence of Israel for many decades was challenged and was questioned by the neighboring countries of Israel. Almost every single nation around Israel doubted and challenged even the right to exist of the Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, over this past 10 years, there was a major change of that today Israel has peaceful relationship not only with Egypt and Jordan, but also increasing now with Gulf states, and even some other countries as far as Morocco are considering their relationship with Israel. They are thinking about building an embassy in Israel, and they have become much more closer to the state of Israel than they have been before. And also the role of Israel itself, the nation itself, has changed dramatically. It's not anymore this agricultural country that is exporting oranges for the world, but it has become an incredible powerhouse of technology, of innovation, of economic strength that is literally transforming the Middle East. We have seen this year, in particular after the election of the previous government, that something historic took place. For the first time in recent decades, the prime minister that was newly elected in Israel did not travel for his first outside Israel visit to the United States to visit the American president, but for the first time, the first outside visit of an Israeli prime minister was to a neighboring country, to the country of Jordan. And the gift that Prime Minister Bennett brought to the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, was that he made a promise of billions of liters of fresh water to Jordan. I remember well the time when people said the next war in the Middle East will be a war over water resources. This situation has changed, and Israel today is not anymore a problem state where nations criticize Israel for the excess use of natural water. Israel has become today, because of its huge resources of water desalination plants all across the Mediterranean coast, a major exporter of water resources for the region. So there is a new situation that Israel today has become part of the solution with its technology, even with its military solution. So many of the neighboring countries of Israel, they do recognize Israel as a solution of their problems, not only technologically or in regard to water resources, but also they see Israel as a strong stability factor in regard to the threat of Iran that is not only threatening Israel, but also many of the Sunni neighboring states of Israel. But also there is another area that Europe needs to recognize that has significantly changed over the recent years. First we saw it was the role of Israel in the Middle East, but secondly also Europe today needs to recognize that there are certain non-negotiables with Israel, some old paradigms that European countries need to get rid of. European countries need to understand that Israel is never to give up on its settlement. They might close one or two smaller outposts in the West Bank or in other areas, but they are never going to give up their major settlement blocks. And I believe it's time for European countries to change their approach in regard to that. They should rather see those settlements as very successful points where coexistence between Arab and Israelis are taking place on a daily basis. I have seen it myself on visits to the Balkan industrial area, where many Palestinians that are coming over from the West Banks are not only earning the very same salary that Israeli workers are supplying, but they are able to take care through that for their entire family. These are the places where their children can get the necessary education. Israeli companies are sending them abroad to get educated in chemistry, electronics and other areas. It's the place where coexistence exists and where we can see peace in the Middle East. So those settlements, they are not obstacle of peace, but I believe you can call them greenhouses, facilitators of peace in the region. And then also we need to understand that Jerusalem is a non-negotiable item for Israel. They will never give up Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the state of Israel. And I wish the European nations would have used these great opportunities 2 years ago when the American administration moved their embassy to Jerusalem to say, yes, we are following suit. We recognize Jerusalem as the undivided and eternal capital of the state of Israel, because we need to understand Israel is never going to give up on the situation and the status of Israel, of Jerusalem. And I want to encourage also all Christians in Norway and in Europe to pray for their governments, that they line up with what's taking place, also with countries like Guatemala and Honduras, who all moved their embassy to Jerusalem. And also we need to understand that this old paradigm of the traditional two-state solution is not relevant anymore, because even Palestinian people today recognize that a two-state solution might just bring the same situation like we see in Gaza to the Middle East, and therefore rather new concepts need to be found, even considering a coexistence between two federal states. And I think this is something which also European governments need a new approach in regard to looking at the Middle East. The practical steps, what European countries can do today to realize or to follow suit on these new realities is, number one, they need to review their undiminished support for UNRWA. UNRWA is the United Nations Refugee Organization for Palestinian refugees, and even in the recent conflict with Gaza, they have proven that they are just aggregating even more violence and terrorism in the region. The UNRWA schools, they are still schools where not peace but incitement and hatred against Israel is being taught. on European tax money. And I'm calling here even on our governments to review the funding of those schools and to find new models to educate young Palestinians in peaceful ways, to teach coexistence and to teach peaceful living together in the region. Secondly, European countries, they need to change the way how they are voting in the United Nations. It is impossible to understand that while the United Nations are reluctant to condemn nations like North Korea, Syria, even Turkey on their human rights violations, but there are on the other side so many resolutions, in some years 14, 15 resolutions against Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. And I'm calling on our European countries, I call on Norway to change the way how they are voting against Israel. Israel deserves the support of every European country. And also I would like to challenge European countries to review the way how they are looking at the Iranian challenge. Iran is a nation that very openly calls for the destruction of Israel. There are proxy organizations, Hezbollah and also Hamas in Gaza. They are following suit with the regime of Iran, calling for the destruction of Israel, and this should not be tolerated. There should no peaceful negotiations with countries that do not accept the only democratic state, the Jewish state of the Middle East. And then finally, as European countries, we do have challenges in our very own nations with anti-Semitism that needs to be addressed. The new anti-Semitism in Europe today is maybe sometimes more an anti-Israelism, a negative attitude that, as I mentioned, you could see how a nation is voting against Israel. This needs to change. Also our media in Europe, they need to be more unbiased. They need to bring a more balanced view about what is happening here in the region. And I'm even calling upon the Christian audience today to write to your media. If you see something is reported in an unbalanced and even wrong way, please let them hear your voice, because we need a fair and balanced reporting from Israel. And finally also, we do have a challenge in our own countries that we imported in recent years and decades. And this is a new form of anti-Semitism that is coming from immigrant communities that mostly come from Arab and Muslim states. And there are many resources that speak about that, how those new groups that are coming to Europe, they hate Israel, they call for the destruction of Israel. And I believe here our governments are called to bring forth very clear guidelines that if you come to our Christian countries, there are certain benchmarks that we expect from new citizens that are joining our countries. And I believe as we are doing this in our country, I honestly believe, as a man who believes in God, God will bless the countries where we are coming from. God will bless Europe, because the word of God is very clear. If you bless God's people, God will bless us in return. And again, I want to call upon all the Christians in Norway, Christians in Europe, to pray for your own government, to align themselves in a better way with the nation of Israel, to see the great opportunities that are coming from Israel, and to take a clear stand with the only democracy in the Middle East, the nation of Israel. With this, I want to wish you God's blessing here from Jerusalem, and I hope I can join you at the Oslo Symposium in 2022. God bless you.